Is this the end? The Continental Army continued fighting and retreating through October and November. The British chased them out of New York City, across the Hudson River, and south into New Jersey. As we go forward into the country, the rebels fly before us, said British Captain William Bamford. "'Tis almost impossible to catch them." Things were looking terrible for Washington's army. What was left of it, that is. Soldiers were deserting every day. Every number of them have gone off, in some instances almost my whole regiments, Washington reported to Congress. To make things worse, men were taking Continental Army guns and ammunition home with them. One guy even tried to take home a cannonball. When it was found in his bag, he had an excuse ready. He wanted to give it to his mother, he said. She could use it to pound spices. By the end of November, Washington had just 3,000 men left. This little army crossed the Delaware River and set up camp in Pennsylvania. Washington sent Congress an update, saying, "The situation of our affairs is critical and truly alarming." Congress agreed. With the British moving closer and closer to Philadelphia, the members of Congress tried to pack up and run away to Baltimore. What else could go wrong? Plenty. Cold weather was coming, and the soldiers had no winter clothing, and there was never enough to eat. Joseph Plum Martin remembered the men in his unit going without food for 2 full days. When they complained of hunger pains, any officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of dried corn that was burnt to a black crisp and said, "Here, eat this and learn to be a soldier." Now, for the worst part, Washington's small army was about to get even smaller. Most of the soldiers had enlisted in the army only until the end of the year. Then they expected to go home for the winter. Martin's enlistment ended in December, and he eagerly traveled home to his family and friends. "They appeared to be glad to see me," he said, "and I am sure I was ready glad to see them." Don't worry, Martin will be back in the army the next year, but Washington couldn't wait until the next year. 10 days more I will put an end to the existence of our army, he wrote on December 20th. Washington had 10 days to save the revolution. Report from Trenton. Across the Delaware River from the American camp was the small town of Trenton, New Jersey. This was one of the many towns now in the hands of the British Army. Guarding the town were about 1,200 German soldiers. Americans called them Hessians because many of them came from the Hesse region of Germany. The Hessians took over most of the houses in Trenton and made themselves comfortable. "My friend Scheffer and I lodge in a fine house belonging to a merchant," wrote one officer. "This kind of invasion should get you out of school, right? Not if you went to Mistresses Rogers' School for Young Ladies in Trenton, which stayed open all winter. We know this from letters that were sent to students that year. William Shippen, for instance, wrote to his daughter Nancy, aged 13, saying, 'My dear Nancy, I was pleased with your French letter, which was much better spelt than your English one. I wish I was sorry I which in which I was sorry to see 4 or 5 words wrong. Take care, my dear girl, of your spelling and your teeth.'" And while most families got out of Trenton when the enemy arrived, a few stayed to try to protect their homes. A 10-year-old girl named Martha Reed stayed in town with her mother and young brother. Her father was off in the Continental Army. Martha later described the cold mid-December night that the enemy showed up at her door. "Mother and we, 2 children, were gathered in the family room," she said. "A great fire blazed in the chimney's place. Suddenly there was a noise outside, and the sound of many feet. The room door opened, and in stalked several strange men. After warming up by the fire, the Hessian soldiers opened the storeroom and ate all the pickles and jarred vegetables. A bit later, they killed a hog and butchered it on the dinner table. Even though Martha's mother spoke no German, she somehow managed to convince the soldiers that her husband was serving in the British Army, so the Hessians agreed to let the Reeds stay in the house. A few days later, a child's coat gave the Reeds away. Martha explained, "To please my little brother, my mother had made for him a officer's coat of the rebel buff, gold and blue, in which we delighted to strut and fight imaginary battles. When the Hessians found this coat, they knew they'd been tricked. They were in the home of the patriots. What a storm broke around us," Martha said. "They shook the little coat in our faces, jabbering and threatening. Martha's mother pulled the children outside, and they all hid in the hen house. Normally a bad hiding place, since the chickens cluck and cackle when they're disturbed. Luckily, the soldiers had already eaten all the chickens. Martha and her family spent a freezing and frightening night in the empty hen house. That was a night I can never forget, she said. The Lion in the Tub. In command of the German forces in Trenton was Colonel Johann Rau, the Lion. Bravery in battle earned Rau his name, but he was also kind of a lazy guy. He liked to stay up late drinking and playing cards. Then he would sleep late and spend the rest of the morning in the tub. There were times, complained one of the officers, when we would go to his quarters for the morning formation between 10 and 11 o'clock and he would still be sitting in his tub. Rau was warned that the Americans might try to attack his army. He laughed and shouted, "Fiddlesticks! These clodhoppers will not attack us." Rau knew the Americans were starving, freezing, and ready to go home. He expected to enjoy a quiet winter at Trenton. Across the river. The sun set at 4:35 on December 25th. Christmas Day had been sunny and cold, about 32 degrees. Now clouds covered the stars, and several mixtures of freezing rain and snow started falling. Washington ordered his soldiers to pack 60 rounds of ammunition and a 3-day supply of salted meat and bread. 16-year-old John Greenwood was one of the many soldiers who wondered where the army was going that night. He was hoping he wouldn't have to march too far because he was suffering from a terrible rash on his legs. Or as he put it, I had to itch then so badly that my breeches stuck to my thighs, all the skin being off, and there were hundreds of vermin upon me. At least Greenwood had shoes. Many of the men had worn through theirs and had to tie rags around their bare feet. The soldiers gathered at the edge of the Delaware River. They saw black water clogged with bobbing, swirling chunks of ice. And they saw John Glover and his fishermen waiting to row them across the river. The boats started crossing and recrossing the water. It took many trips to get everyone over. Colonel Henry Knox, the cannon expert, was determined to get 18 cannons over the river also. The floating ice in the river made the labor almost incredible, he reported. The night was so cold and stormy it hailed with great violence. John Greenwood was one of the first to cross the river. Then he stood on the New Jersey side, waiting for hours. It rained, hailed, snowed, and froze, and at the same time blew a perfect hurricane. He said, and he and the other men pulled down fences and lit fire in a useless effort to keep warm. They watched the boats and waited. Washington was watching and waiting too. I have never seen Washington so determined as he is now. An American named John Fitzgerald wrote in his diary, he stands in the bank of the river, wrapped in his cloak, superintending the lands of the troops. He is calm and collected, but very determined. The plan had been to get the army across the Delaware River by midnight, but thanks to the ice in the river, it took until 3 in the morning. Washington knew he would not be able to reach Trenton before dawn. I determined to push on at all events, he said. The army began the 9-mile march to Trenton. Surprise. You often read about the weather being a major factor in historical events. This was definitely true of the Trenton attack. On most nights, the Hessians in Trenton sent soldiers out to patrol the roads leading into town, but the night of December 25th was too cold and nasty. The routine patrol was canceled. So Colonel Rau and his men were quite surprised when Washington and the Americans marched into town about 8 o'clock in the morning. Hessian soldiers grabbed their guns and ran out into the street. By the time they figured out what was going on, though, Washington's men already had the town surrounded. And Henry Knox had his cannons set up and ready to go. These, in the twinkling of an eye, cleared the streets. Knox reported. There was absolutely nowhere for the Hessians to hide. They ran toward houses, but many of the women who had stayed in town suddenly stuck guns out the windows and started firing. The Battle of Trenton was over quickly. Colonel Rau was shot and killed. His entire army surrendered except for a few men who managed to escape down the road. This is a glorious day for our country, Washington told his officers. And to make the day even better, American soldiers found lots of good stuff scattered around town. John Greenwood took a German sword as a souvenir. An American drummer threw his own drum away and picked up a much nicer German one. Other soldiers stayed, I'm sorry, other soldiers put on fancy brass German officers' hats and strutted around town. Saved for now. After beating the Americans all year, British leaders in London had been sure they were about to win the war, but all hopes were blasted by that unhappy affair at Trenton, said George Germain, King George's top war advisor. Washington wasn't done yet, though. He marched his troops to the town of Princeton and won another quick victory. These winter wins inspired thousands of new soldiers to join the army. The American Revolution was alive. A loyalist named Nicholas Creswell was truly sorry to see the sudden change in the mood of Americans. A few days ago, they had given up the cause for loss, Creswell said. Their late successes have turned the scale now. They are all liberty mad again. But King George was still feeling confident. In fact, he had a new war plan, and he looked forward to crushing the revolution in 1777. Showdown at Saratoga. The British General John Burgundy celebrated Christmas in 1776 by placing a bet on the American Revolution. Burgundy wagered 50 golden guineas that he could beat the Americans and be home victorious from America by Christmas Day 1777. This was a bold bet. To win it, Burgundy would have to cross the Atlantic, crush the revolution, get back to London, all in 1 year. No secrets here. What made General John Burgundy so confident about crushing the American Revolution? 2 words: the plan. Burgundy has spent the past few months working on a detailed plan for winning the war. He presented the secret strategy to King George. The king loved it. So in the spring of 1777, Burgundy loaded cases of champagne onto a ship. He always traveled in style and set out across the ocean with high hopes. General Burgundy arrived in Quebec, Canada, in early May. As soon as he got off the boat, he started hearing people talk about his so-called secret strategy. The Quebec newspaper even had an article about it, describing exactly how Burgundy planned to defeat the Americans. As usual in this war, neither side could keep anything secret. Burgundy was annoyed, but not discouraged, so the Americans knew his plan. So what? That didn't mean they could stop him. The basic idea of the plan was simple: slice the United States in two. This would be done by attacking the centrally located state of New York from the north and the south at the same time. Once the British controlled New York, all of New England would be cut off from the rest of the United States. So different regions wouldn't be able to help each other out by sending soldiers or supplies back and forth. It would be like having an enemy's hands around your neck. The revolution could be strangled. Benedict Arnold to the rescue. Like everyone else, George Washington knew about Burgundy's plan, but there was very little he could do. The British still had their main army under the command of General William Howe camped in and around New York City. Washington was worried that Howe would try to capture Philadelphia that year, so he had to keep his army nearby to prevent it. You can't just let the enemy capture your capital city, can you? A separate American army, known as the Northern Army, would have to stop Burgundy's invasion. Washington couldn't send many soldiers to the Northern Army, but he could at least send one of his top generals. He picked a former merchant from Connecticut named Benedict Arnold. Arnold had already fought in many of the war's fiercest battles, and he was known for his attacking style and reckless bravery. Here's how one American soldier described Arnold's reputation in 1777. He was our fighting general, and a bloody fellow he was. He didn't care for nothing. He'd ride right in. He was a brave man as ever lived. True, Arnold was also known as perhaps the most annoying man in America. His loud, bossy style made him almost impossible to work with. But this was no time to worry about personality conflicts. Washington needed a fighter in northern New York, so he sent his best one. We have one advantage over our enemy, Arnold said as he headed north. It's our power to be free or nobly die in defense of liberty. Franklin's secret mission. Meanwhile in Philadelphia, Ben Franklin packed up a lunch, climbed into a carriage with his 2 grandsons, and set off on a picnic. A picnic, Ben, at a time like this? Don't worry, it was part of a secret plan to help win the revolution. The plan was based on a simple fact, sad but true: the United States could not win this war without help. George Washington might win a small battle here and there, but the Continental Congress did not have enough soldiers, guns, and ships to defeat mighty Great Britain. What the Americans needed was a powerful ally. So Congress decided to try to persuade France to join forces with the United States. And Congress believed that 71-year-old Ben Franklin was the man to do the convincing. Franklin was famous and highly respected in France. They just might listen to him. But first, Franklin had to actually get to France. And with British spies snooping around every corner in Philadelphia, this was going to be a dangerous trip. If the British found out about Franklin's plans, they would chase down his ships as it crossed the Atlantic Ocean. That would be the end of Ben Franklin. So Franklin and his two grandsons, William, age 17, and Benjamin, 7, rode out of town on an innocent little picnic. Then, when they saw they hadn't been followed, they drove the carriage to a small port on the Delaware River, and 3 of them climbed onto a waiting ship. 6 weeks later, they were safely in France. Well, think about it. Battered and exhausted by the rough sea journey, Franklin had no time for rest. He and the boys jumped onto a carriage and hurried towards Paris, the French capital. The carriage was a miserable one, Franklin remembered, with tired horses, the evening dark, scarce a traveler but ourselves on the road, and the dark road was far from safe. The driver stopped near a wood we were to pass through to tell us that a gang of 18 robbers infested that wood, who but 2 weeks ago had murdered some travelers on that very spot. Luckily, Franklin managed to avoid the French bandits, but the British spies spotted him right away. David Stormont, the British ambassador to France, rushed to report to his bosses in London. I learnt yesterday evening that the famous Dr. Franklin is arrived, wrote Stormont. I cannot but suspect that he might be charged with a secret mission from the Congress. In a word, my lord, I look upon him as a dangerous engine. A few days later, young William Franklin, sent on an errand from his grandfather, he went to the French foreign minister's office and delivered a letter stating that Benjamin Franklin was here in Paris to negotiate a treaty of friendship between the United States and France. The official French reply was basically, well, we'll think about it. Sure, King Louis XVI and his friends were still bitter about losing the French and Indian War to their old enemy Britain. The French were definitely hungry for a little revenge. They didn't want to join this new war, though, unless they were sure the Americans could actually win it. And so far, the Americans had lost most of the big battles. French leaders decided to wait and see how the fight went in 1777. Franklin settled in for a long stay in France. He couldn't accomplish much until there was some good news from home. The news from home. At first, there was no good news to report, unless you were rooting for the British. In July, General Burgoyne accomplished the first part of his plan. He captured Fort Ticonderoga from the Americans. This news delighted King George, who skipped into Queen Charlotte's bedroom, clapping and yelling, "I have beat them, beat the Americans." The next step for Burgoyne's big army was to march about 30 miles from Fort Ticonderoga to the Hudson River. Things were going smoothly. Baroness Friederike von Riedesel, for one, was having a wonderful time. Wife of the German General Frederick von Riedesel, the Baroness was one of the hundreds of women who were traveling with Burgoyne's army. Wives also often went to war with their husbands in the 1700s. The Baroness even thought her 3 young daughters alone. As she wrote, this was an exciting opportunity for the family to see the world. Baroness von Riedesel. When the weather was good, we had our meals out under the trees, otherwise we had them in the barn, laying boards across barrels for tables. It was here that I had bear meat for the first time, and it tasted very good to me. Then, just when everyone was having a fine time, the British started running into trouble. John Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny by his troops because he treated them well, insisted on living in luxury even in the middle of a war. He needed 30 wagons just to haul all his champagne and fancy foods. This really slowed down the march, especially since the army was traveling over narrow paths through muddy, mosquito-filled forests. and the Americans were doing a great job of making their British visitors feel unwelcomed. American soldiers destroyed the bridges and rolled boulders and logs into the road. They dammed up streams, causing them to flood to the forest paths. Local farmers even burned their own crops just to make sure the British wouldn't find anything to eat in New York. Burgundy was able to advance only 1 mile a day. By the beginning of September, his army was down to just a month's supply of food. And there was more bad news. You'll remember that Burgundy's plan called for General William Howe to lead a second British army north from New York City. Now Burgundy learned that Howe's army wasn't coming. General Howe had decided that he would rather attack Philadelphia than operate with Burgundy's plan. Howe didn't like Burgundy, and since he outranked Burgundy, he could do whatever he wanted. He can do whatever he wanted. Gentleman Johnny was starting to sweat. When I wrote more confidently, I had not foreseen that I was to be left to pursue my way through such a tract of country and host of foes without any cooperation from New York. The leaves of the trees in northern New York were just starting to change from green to yellow and orange. To Burgundy, the colorful leaves were a painful reminder that it was getting late in the year. If he was going to turn and march his army back to the safety in Canada, he had to do it right then before winter weather made the trip impossible. Burgundy thought about it and decided to continue the attack. His army would not try to fight its way to South Albany, where it could spend the winter indoors. This army must not retreat, he told his men. Was he thinking about the bet he made back in London?